Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So we're talking about Epiphany today. It was technically yesterday, but close enough. And focused on the reading from Matthew 2 about the wise men coming to visit Jesus as a child. And we're thinking about trade. And when I think about trade, first thing comes to my mind is that in 1965, Cincinnati Reds general manager decided that Frank Robinson, at the tender age of 30, was too old and likely past his prime, and so he traded him to Baltimore. At the time, Robinson had played about 10 years, hit over 320 home runs. Well, Frank Robinson wasn't quite ready to be put out to pasture. He would go on to play another 12 seasons, hit another 260 home runs, as well as winning the MVP of the 1966 World Series with Baltimore. And then he won the World Series again in 1970, and you'll never guess who they beat. Easily the worst trade in Cincinnati Reds history. Fortunately, not the worst trade in baseball history. No, that one belongs to the owner of the Boston Red Sox, Harry Frazee, in 1920 when he needed some cash to finance a musical that he was in charge of. He sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for $100,000 in a loan to finance No Nanette. Babe Ruth and the Yankees went on to win everything for the next few decades, while the Red Sox needed another 100 years to win another World Series. A terrible, terrible trade. Bad trades don't only happen in sports. 2006, there was a guy that worked at a large hedge fund that traded natural gas, and he thought prices were going to rise, and he bet big. Bought a lot of futures contracts. In September of that year, prices started to drop, and he was so wrong that by the end of the month, he was down $3 billion, with a B, $3 billion. Convinced that he'd be right eventually, he doubled down, only to see prices fall further, with total losses eventually being over $6.5 billion. The entire hedge fund was liquidated. It's a bad trade. Think about what a trade is. It is an exchange of one thing for the value of another. Trades happen when both parties value something the other party has more than the thing they have. Sometimes works out great for both parties. Other times works out better for one than the other, although it takes time to realize this, as this is due to an imbalance in information. We simply don't know what will happen in the future. Reds didn't think Frank Robinson could play baseball in his 30s as well as he had in his 20s. Harry Frazee really thought his musical was going to go well and thought that was more valuable than Babe Ruth. Somebody thought natural gas prices were definitely going to go up. He was wrong. Spectacularly wrong. It happens. We make trades too. We don't think about it in the same way, but every time we spend money, we're making the decision that the goods or services that we receive are worth more than the money we're paying for them. And so we exchange that hard-earned money for something. If you're like us, you're grumbling every time you go to the grocery store because it takes more money to exchange for the same groceries than it did a few years ago, but you're also deciding that it's worth it to eat food because food is still of higher value than money. So we trade that money for food. We trade our time too. If you decide to watch a show on Netflix, you're offering an hour of your time for some entertainment. You're trading that. We've all made some bad trades when it comes to watching shows or reading books, things we've gotten halfway into, and all of a sudden more information has become available, and we've realized that we don't want to make, we wish we hadn't made this trade. And then the question is, what kind of person are we? Are you the kind of person who will stick through it and watch it because you've started it? Or are you the kind of person that cuts bait? When it comes to books, even if it's a book that I realize halfway through I don't like, I need to finish the book. It's just something within me. And I realize I made a bad trade and I'm still making a bad trade as I continue to read the book of giving up my time, my energy for it. But I need to finish it. And so we all make different decisions about how we trade our money, how we trade our time, how we trade our energy, and what we're getting back for that. And a trade is if we think about it in the wrong way, or it's purely transactional way, it's one way a lot of people think about Christianity. And we can approach God in this transactional way. We think of trading a prayer or some act of devotion. to God in order to get what we want. Of, hey, God, I'll give you this as long as you give me this. And God, if you don't seem to be holding up your end of the bargain, maybe I'll stop making this trade. We think of God as, and I've talked about it before, the vending machine in the sky where we're putting quarters in and we want to get something out. But God's right. God's not simply looking for a transaction. That's not what discipleship looks like. God wants more. To paraphrase, I think it was C.S. Lewis, we invite God into our house to clean up the closet, maybe redesign a back room, and all of a sudden we discover that God starts knocking down walls because God wants more for us. God has this eternal vision for us where we grow into the full vision of who God made us to be in the image of God. And so Jesus comes in and starts knocking down walls because Jesus wants to build us into a palace so that we're fit for Christ to dwell in us. So that's God's desire for us. And our prayers often aren't answered in the ways that we want because God has a longer term and a bigger vision for us that fits in an eternal scope, not just in the here and now. And so the question is, what do we give up? What do we trade? Right? What are we willing to offer for that? Our service today is framed around Epiphany, the visit of the wise men to see Jesus. They likely didn't appear when Jesus was first born, to the dismay of all our nativity scenes. But the point is that these wise men from the East, they undertook this long and perilous and arduous journey to travel and see the Christ child, a remarkable story. When you think about what they gave up, what they traded, much of their money, months of their time, to travel and see a child under 2 years of age. Why? Why would they do that? They brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, costly treasures not obtained lightly. Why would they travel and give these to a small child in a distant land? They must have believed something remarkable, for they were willing to trade this significant part of their resources to come and see the child. Nobody does that lightly. We're so accustomed to how easy travel is that we fail to appreciate how hard this journey would have been. My mom often will drive up from Kentucky to Columbus, have lunch with Rachel, and turn around and drive home. And it's a fairly easy trip. But imagine doing that on a camel without I-71, with no rest stops or fast food restaurants along the way. Oh, and there's people that might rob you everywhere you stop. You don't do that unless you believe that it's really important. You wouldn't trade your money, your time, possibly your safety, to undertake such a journey unless you thought that person was truly world-changing. And the Magi, the wise men, they saw this. They understood the scope of how significant Christ's birth was. And so to honor the Christ child, they were willing to trade this huge amount of their resources, time, money, just to be in his presence, to offer him gifts. And I think about, are we willing to give up a lot? What would we trade to be in the presence of Christ? Do we value Christ's presence that highly that we will undertake offering our resources, heavy resources like this, because it's of more value than anything else in the world? I heard someone say once that probably the most common sin that Christians have is that we love Christ too little, and I think about that a lot. Martin Luther talked about how we love other things more, and then when we think about that in trading, we value other things more, and so we'll trade for those things more often than we will of giving up our resources, our time and our love and our energy, and giving that to Christ. I mean, think about the week that is to come, when we will all trade time and energy for various endeavors. What will you trade your resources for? If you want more of the presence of Christ in your life, how can you use your resources to trade for that? Can you redirect time and energy that you're giving away to something that doesn't exist on an eternal time frame? Can you change the way you think about money? Every day you're going to make choices about how you spend your attention. What if you could focus on having more of the presence of Christ within you? What would you trade for that? It's remarkable to think about what Christ gave up for us. He dwelt in the fullness of heaven, spending eternity with God. He's in the middle of love and grace and mercy and peace, and he traded that kingdom, he traded that palace for a shack. He became poor, trading all the riches of heaven so that he could have you, because he thought you were of such surpassing value. He was willing to trade all of that to transform you into that palace, into a place fit for a king to dwell. Christ couldn't stand being separated from you. So he made a trade. He gave himself over to the powers of sin, to the powers of death. And in return, God obtained you. A remarkable trade, and Christ received exactly what Christ wanted. And we can't say that it was a bad trade, because God knows everything. And so there's no imbalance of information. It's not like the Reds trading away Frank Robinson and being like, oops, we got that one wrong. Christ has perfect knowledge, and so Christ knew what God was getting and still made that trade. It's not a way we think about ourselves very often, being an item that Christ valued more than remaining in heaven and dwelling in perfection with the entire Trinity. We don't think of ourselves often as a palace, a place redeemed by God and fit for a king to dwell in. And the question is, how do we trade our time? How do we trade our energy? So we experience that more in our lives. We're going to spend eternity with God, reaping the benefits of this trade that cost Christ and benefited us. But we get the chance to practice for that life while we're here on earth. The Magi realized something extraordinary has happened. So they did everything they could just to be in the presence of Christ for just a few moments. And when I think about some of the things that I get frustrated at, some of the ways that I spend my time and energy, things I trade my resources for, they're going to matter in months, in weeks, let alone for eternity. If I can get not so wrapped up in them, maybe I'll have more energy to read the Psalms, to let the presence of God fill me up. When I trade my passion in life or my time for things that don't matter on an eternal time frame, often I'm making a bad trade. I can look back at some of the ways I've spent time and energy, and oftentimes it's like trading away Babe Ruth for a musical that no one will remember. Right? No one forgets Babe Ruth. But the Red Sox owner took that for granted and grabbed something in the short term. It was a bad trade. May we not make the same mistake. May we trade in time and energy and use our resources wisely, focused on the eternal things, giving thanks that Christ traded his life in righteousness so that we might dwell forever with God. Thanks be to God.